Order. Daniel Kawczynski to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Ms Cummings, for calling me in this debate on British sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory. And before I start to talk about this British overseas territory, I'd just like to say that I've returned last week from another British overseas territory, the Falkland Islands, with my honourable friend, the member for Bracknell, and the opposition spokesman, the honourable member for Cardiff South and Penarth, the Shadow Minister for Overseas Territories. We've just spent 9 days together in the Falkland Islands, inspecting the defences of the islands, meeting with islanders, and, most importantly, commemorating the 40th anniversary celebrations of the liberation of these islands in June of 1982. I'd like to pay tribute to the Shadow Minister for Overseas Territories. He and I, during the course of our visit, disagreed on almost everything. Politically, culturally, socially, everything. But we were in unison and total agreement of the need to protect the Falkland Islands and their right for self-determination. And self-determination is a concept that I want to return to over and over again during the course of this speech and this debate. This is the lesson, Ms Cummings, that we have learned from the conflict in the Falkland Islands. And yes, I recognise that the British Indian Ocean Territory is different to the Falkland Islands, and there are different perspectives and narratives and parameters to these two overseas territories. But one thing which is not divisible and is equally important, wherever you are in any British overseas territory, is the concept of self-determination. We cannot negotiate sovereignty of a territory without the legitimacy of consultation of the islanders and the people who are originally from that territory. Now, why do I mention the Falkland Islands? I mention them because we have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to learn from the mistakes that the Foreign Office has made in the past. And one thing which I was told over and over again during the course of our visit to the Falkland Islands was that Lord Chalfont, a Labour minister in the Foreign Office in the late 60s, was sent to the Falkland Islands in 1968 by the Foreign Office to try to convince the islanders to abandon Great Britain. They should ditch their links with Britain and they should become Argentinian. This is something that the Falkland Islands people repeatedly referenced. They've written pamphlets and books about that occasion where a Labour Foreign Office minister was sent there to the Falkland Islands to try to entice, cajole, and manoeuvre an entire people to abandon their cultural heritage, their links, and their status as being part of the British family. I'm very pleased that the Falkland Islanders sent Lord Chalfont back home with the unequivocal message, we wish to remain British. We are British, and we are determined to continue to be part of the British family. I would argue that the poor handling of the situation over the Falkland Islands, in part, the poor handling by the Foreign Office in the late 60s and 70s, in part, led to and contributed to the war that then was instigated in 1982. And one thing I won't forget from my visit to the Falkland Islands is when the Honourable Member for Bracknell, the Honourable Member for South Cardiff and Penarth and I were taken to the top of Mount Tumbledown, and we saw the horrendous situation that our armed forces faced in trying to retake the islands. We paused on many occasions during that trip to the Falkland Islands where we laid wreaths and we spent time quietly together commemorating the lives of those British soldiers who gave up their lives to protect this British territory. And when the Foreign Office does make mistakes, and when the Foreign Office miscalculates, it's not civil servants or politicians who suffer, it's British soldiers who sometimes have to lay down their lives. And now, I believe, the Foreign Office is making the same mistakes that they were making with the Falkland Islands with the British Indian Ocean Territory. I'm deeply concerned that the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, made a decision in her extraordinarily brief premiership. She nevertheless made a decision to start negotiations with Mauritius over the sovereignty of these beautiful islands, 58 of them in the Indian Ocean. I've debated this issue with many colleagues, and the message from some of them is this: we are in negotiations with Mauritius due to rulings against us at the United Nations and at the International Court of Justice. Let's conclude these negotiations, and then at some stage we will consult the Chagossians. And those are the responses that I've received in many written parliamentary questions. Don't interfere in the negotiations now. Let us conclude these negotiations. They're very sensitive. It's all rather discreet, but let us conclude them, and at some stage in the future, we will consult with the Chagossians. No, no, no. That is putting the cart before the horse. And I would argue that, first of all, this government, if it has any intention to transfer even one of these 58 islands, needs to have a referendum of the Chagossian people, and they need to make a decision themselves, rather than us even starting to negotiate with Mauritius. Now, honourable members and right honourable members will know that the Labour government in the late 1960s expelled between 1,400 and 1,700 Chagossians. And I'm very pleased that my honourable friend, the member for Crawley, is here in this debate, who represents a very large contingent of Chagossians who settled in his constituency when they arrived in the United Kingdom, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And I know that the honourable member from Manchester, Wythenshawe and Sale East also represents 400 Chagossians. So between the two of them, between these two gentlemen, they represent the lion's share of Chagossians who are living in the United Kingdom.
You will remember to give way.
I will give way.
Thank you, honourable member. He's making a very excellent speech. Who would vote in this referendum? Mauritian Chagossians, the Chagossians in the honourable member's constituency, second generation, third generation, people that have moved around the world, because there is actually no one on the island that's Chagossian. Who would this referendum be for?
Well, that's a very pertinent and sensible and critical question, and not one that I have an answer to in this debate. I want to raise at this stage the concept and the extraordinary need to make sure that these Chagossians are consulted. The government, in their answers in written parliamentary questions, have stated that they will consult with the Chagossians. It will be for the government ultimately, if we secure a commitment from them for a referendum by the Chagossians, to work with legal minds far superior to mine to create a framework by which a referendum could take place. The Chagossians were expelled, and I want to stand here and apologise, as I'm sure others will apologise, to the Chagossian people. These beautiful people who were expelled from their islands in 1968 to make way for an American military base. Nothing can erase the shame that we feel as British citizens that our ancestors treated the Chagossians in this way, to rip them away from their beautiful islands and to cast them to the Seychelles, Maldives, Britain, and Mauritius is unforgivable. And we can only apologise at this stage for what happened to them. The military base was set up to counter growing Chinese and Soviet belligerence in the Indian Ocean and beyond. And today we see a similar belligerence from Russia and especially China. And that's the point I want to get across in this debate. We've got to look at what's going on in that region.
Will you give way?
I will.
Madam Chair, thank you very much indeed. I may be one of the very few, if not only parliamentarian, to actually have been to the British Indian Ocean Territory on duty as a military person. So I've seen firsthand how important that base is to NATO and beyond. For me, it's clear. We have 2 submarine Z-berths there. We have a large airbase, an airbase that was directly involved with the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's an American airbase, which is owned by the British. To my mind, it would be pathological nonsense to concede access to that part of the world.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm very grateful for his intervention. I won't give way for a few minutes because I've got a lot to get through, but I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's contribution. This is the key issue. I started, and I want to get on the record, and I want to criticise my own side. I'm not prone to criticising the Conservative Party, but I'm going to enjoy myself this afternoon. I want to let rip. 7 years ago, I started to ask questions of the Conservative government. What is the government's understanding and how will it react to the fact that a fellow permanent member of the UN Security Council, and by the way, situation peculiar to only 5 nations in the world to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and with that status comes a tremendous amount of responsibility. I asked the then Foreign Secretary, Mr. Hammond, what is this government's perception of the fact that China has hoovered up hundreds of atolls in the South China Sea, stolen them from Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, poured concrete onto them, and turned them into giant military installations, extending their reach by over 1,000 kilometres by stealing all of these islands from all of these countries. And I've met with the ambassadors from Vietnam and Philippines and Malaysia and others who have expressed to me great concerns about what the Chinese are doing. It's only because of British and American freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea that this waterway, through which 65% of the world's trade passes through, is still open. Otherwise, the Chinese would have tried to turn it into a Chinese lake. And the government's response, and this is extraordinary, the government's response, Mr. Hammond's response was, the British government does not get involved, nor has any opinion on the disputes of uninhabited atolls in the South China Sea. How regrettable, Miss Cummings, that answer came 7 years ago, because I would argue, Miss Cummings, that it was the government's lack of action in China, stealing hundreds of these atolls, which is the thin end of the wedge. And it gave the brutal communist dictatorship of China a green light. Yes, it's okay for us to steal other people's territories. Yes, it's okay for us to pour concrete onto these atolls and turn them into military installations, because the British aren't going to do anything about it.
The Honourable Gentleman be good, Madam
Yes, sir.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman. He's making very strong points on China and their influence in the atolls. In his impression, is it around setting up military bases, or is it about telecoms and listening in and disrupting global communications rather than establishing military bases? Because that would be even more worrying than the assertion that he's made.
Well, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and of course it's a combination of both factors, with the Chinese trying to extend the tentacles of their reach throughout the whole of the region to put smaller countries under pressure. But the Chinese, I would argue, Miss Cummings, control Mauritius through their Belt and Road policy, as they do with so other many small nations around the world. Guess which is the first African nation which received a free trade agreement with China? Mauritius. Guess which is the country, a tiny little island, small economy, but guess which is the country that's received over $1 billion in investment from China over the last few years? Mauritius. And I would argue that the moment we give Mauritius some of these outer islands, and there are 58 of them, Mauritius will lease one or some of the islands to the Chinese almost instantaneously. We don't know the conversations that are taking place between Beijing and Port Louis. We don't know, but we cannot discount and interpret what the financial statistics are saying about the control of the Chinese of Mauritius. Even if they let us keep Diego Garcia, and this is, I think, a nuanced argument that certain politicians and colleagues have said to me, don't rock the boat. These are very delicate negotiations. We've got to maintain our control over Diego Garcia. If that means giving away some of the other islands and coming to a compromise, then so be it. No, not at the moment. I will in a second. No, because if the mantra is to keep Diego Garcia whilst giving some of the other islands away, can you imagine what would happen to the viability and sustainability of our and the American bases on Diego Garcia? It would be absolutely intolerable for us, and by the way, I have visited our military bases on Diego Garcia. I have spent days meeting with American officials on the islands who briefed me, who showed me around the naval vessels and all the installations that are there. Can you imagine us having these huge military bases with the Chinese just a stone's throw away from us, just in the other islands? It would be completely unacceptable. I visited Peros Baños, one of the outer islands, after sailing overnight from Diego Garcia, the island where the military base is. Islanders on Peros Baños were expelled in 1970 as that island was perceived to be too close to our military base. The Chinese have shown form. They are the world experts as to how to turn atolls into military installations. And the argument that Peros Baños and the other islands are too small and insignificant, too low under sea level for them to be viable, well, the Chinese have proved that concept completely wrong. They've managed to do this so successfully in the South China Sea. There has been an appalling injustice, which we must now right. Rather than accommodating spurious demands of Mauritius, we need to consult the indigenous people living in Britain, Mauritius, Maldives, and the Seychelles. And I just want to, at this stage, read out a statement from Frankie Bontemps, a constituent of my honourable friend from Crawley. He is an NHS worker working at the hospital in Crawley. He's from the Chagos Islands. I had a long and somewhat emotional telephone conversation with him last night. Tremendous man who I'm looking forward to meeting in the House of Commons. This is what he writes. Mr. Bontemps from the Chagos Islands. I am a founding member of Chagossian Voices. I don't agree that islands should go to Mauritius. Chagossians have never been consulted at any stage, and Chagossians were never represented at the International Court or before. Chagossians have been used by the Mauritian government at the ICJ to get sympathy by providing an account of suffering. Then they were dismissed as Mauritians of Chagossian origin. They have erased our identity. This is the allegation. They have erased our identity. The Mauritian government was also complicit in the exile of Chagossians and the sale of the islands in 1965. And this is a fascinating concept. Mauritius took our money in 1965. They took our £3 million of taxpayers' money. Think to yourselves for a moment how much £3 million was in 1965. They took our money as final settlement for these islands. They were complicit in helping the removal of the Chagossians from Diego Garcia and the other islands. And now, 60 years on, they want to overturn that agreement and they want to take these islands away from us, islands which are over 2,000 kilometers away from Mauritius. he goes on to say Chagossians do not feel they are Mauritians. Chagossians feel they are still being exploited by the Mauritian government. Mauritius wants sovereignty of the islands for financial gain, and I do not think there will be resettlement of Chagossians under Mauritian rule. And he goes on to say this, and this is very evocative, very powerful, very emotional. It is wrong to describe Chagossians as Mauritians. Their origins are as slaves from Africa and Madagascar. The Chagossians have been there for 5 or 6 generations with their own language and culture, food and music traditions. It is a remote and unique culture, different to Mauritius. Then he says the judgment of Lord Justice Laws and Mr. Justice Gibbs in November 2000 said Chagossians are the belongers on the islands. As belongers, Chagossians should be their own deciders of their futures, not the Mauritian government. Self-determination should be for Chagossians, not for Mauritians who have their own island more than 2,000 kilometers away. So far, only the United Kingdom and Mauritius have been consulted. Chagossians have never been allowed to participate in decisions about their future, from exile until now. Chagossians should now be asked to decide the future of the islands. Chagossians should be around the table. It's our human right. He then goes on to say, Mr. Bontemps then goes on to say that he has written a letter to the Foreign Secretary asking for these assurances, dated the 11th of November 2022, and they have not as yet received a reply from the Foreign Secretary to that request. I'd like to thank Rob Crilly, a reporter from the Daily Mail, USA edition. He has written a story about this debate, and as a result of that story, I was contacted this week by Republican Congressman Mike Waltz, ranking member of the Military Readiness Subcommittee in the Congress of the United States of America. Mr. Waltz, Representative Waltz, is now likely to become chairman of this powerful, important group, as the Republicans have won the congressional elections recently. US bases are under their jurisdiction. And I want you to know I had a very long, fruitful discussion with the team of Congressman Waltz to highlight to them my concerns about the negotiations that our own government has entered into with Mauritius. I briefed his team about this debate, and they are extremely concerned by the news and the ramifications for them as to what would happen to their naval base if they had to share this archipelago with the Chinese. Even if we retain Diego Garcia, the other islands would be up for lease to the Chinese. We have seen what Mauritius is doing with the Agalega Island. The Agalega Island is one of their... in a second, I will. Agalega Island is one of the Mauritian islands, which they have given or leased to the Indians. The indigenous population of their atoll has been removed. Massive destruction has taken place on this atoll to accommodate an Indian military base. So the Mauritians have fallen. They want to get as many, they understand the importance of the Indian Ocean. They understand how geographically significant it is. And the Mauritius is in the market to gain as many of these atolls as possible, ultimately to sell them either to the Indians or to the Chinese, or to whoever is the highest bidder. That is in stark contrast to the United Kingdom, that is seeking to protect these 58 islands. A massive conservation area has been created around the islands, twice the size of the United Kingdom, which is protecting marine and wildlife. No fishing, no oil drilling, nothing takes place because these islands are protected. Whereas if anybody is interested in what Mauritius is doing with these atolls, they should Google that information. they are wanting these islands to sell them to make money. And ultimately, the Mauritius, if we allow them to do this, will facilitate in the militarization of the Indian Ocean. Now, I'm coming to conclude my arguments, and I will give way in a second, but what I would like to say is this. We have beaten the French to secure participation in AUKUS, one of the most important military agreements that we've signed in this government's tenure of office. We are re-entering the Indian Ocean and the Pacific through our arrangement with the Americans and the Australians. AUKUS is absolutely essential. It was Lee Kuan Yew, as you know, Ms. Cummings, who remonstrated with the United Kingdom when we left Singapore in 1971. He understood the ramifications of what would happen to that region if the United Kingdom was to abandon her bases. In that period of lacking in self-confidence, in that period of retrenchment that we went through in the early 70s, we left all of these areas. And it was Lee Kuan Yew and others who foresaw the difficulties that would ensue if we did that. Finally, we have the confidence to re-enter the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And the AUKUS military agreement, Ms. Cummings, is absolutely essential, in conjunction with our membership of the CPTPP, the Far East Trading Bloc, which we are entering next year. These islands are essential for our geopolitical strategy of supporting allies in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific from growing Chinese belligerence. I speak as the only Member of Parliament to have been born in a communist country, the only British Member of Parliament who has lived under communist oppression and tyranny. I know what the communists are capable of, and I know the way in which the Chinese Communist government is threatening and bullying many smaller countries in the region. It would be madness to allow, as my honourable friend has said, it would be madness to allow the Chinese to enter the Indian Ocean through their puppet client state of Mauritius. I hope the Chagossians, listening to this debate across the United Kingdom and in Mauritius and in the Seychelles, listen to us, listen to the strength of feeling that many of us have to demonstrate to them that we, as a former imperial power, recognize the mistakes that we have made, and now, in the new modern era, will put at the very forefront the concept and integrity of self-determination. And if any of these islands are to be abandoned, then they can only be done so through the legitimacy and acceptance of the Chagossian people, which I don't think is there. And that's the fascinating thing, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my honourable friend, and I will stop shortly so that he can speak. But in all my discussions with the Chagossians, they are up for this. They are up for remaining British. We can convince them to vote in the referendum to remain British. So that is the question that I want to pose to the Minister. Why are we negotiating with the Mauritius government before the Chagossians have been consulted? And the last thing I will say is this, and I'm going to use parliamentary privilege for the first time in 17 years. There are British citizens, who I won't name in this debate, who are actively conspiring to aid and abet Mauritius to take these islands from the United Kingdom. I won't begin to tell you what I think of these individuals, but I very much hope they will be thwarted in their actions. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Ms Cummings. I'm not entirely sure where to begin. I want to, I suppose, congratulate the member on securing the debate and welcome his interest in this issue. Many of us in the Chamber are members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Chagos Islands and British Indian Ocean Territory, and I've spoken frequently in Westminster Hall and the main chamber on the questions of sovereignty and the rights of the islanders and their descendants. And I don't recall ever seeing the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham at one of those APPG meetings. I haven't gone through the minutes of all 30, meetings that have taken place since I joined it in 2016, so perhaps I've missed them. But a quick search of Hansard will... yes?
Can I just on the record state that I have attended some of these meetings, and I suspect that he's getting wrong information, because we can show him accounts of me attending those meetings.
That's right. No, I'm very happy to stand. I'm very happy to stand corrected on that. As far as I could tell from a search on Hansard, he's mentioned the British Indian Ocean Territory once in his career here in this place, and that was last year in a debate on AUKUS. And I think his peroration probably gave us a sense of the real priorities behind the debate that has been called today. At a base level, I don't disagree. I absolutely think that the Chagossian community should be involved and consulted in the negotiations on the future of the islands. That's what many of us who've been involved in the all-party group have been campaigning on for many, many years. I would just say to him, good luck in getting the United Kingdom government to recognise the sovereignty of a people and deciding that their democratic future should be decided in a referendum on the future of their territory, because the UK government is very clearly against that kind of democratic process. But I think it is important that we find a way to make sure that the community are properly consulted. But I suspect the issue will divert away from the specific question of sovereignty and more into an issue of their rights and the future of their connection with the islands themselves. The community, as the Honourable Member recognises, is quite widely dispersed because of the actions, the historical actions of the United Kingdom government. And it is incredibly diverse as well, and different groups will have different views on exactly what a resolution should look like. But a mechanism that can include the diaspora, I think, would be welcome. But it might be, as he alluded to himself, it might be impossible. But there's no reason that the governments that represent them can't put their interests at the forefront when they're at the table, because he's right, there is a Chagossian community that is represented by the United Kingdom government, there is a Chagossian community that is represented by the government of Mauritius, and there's a Chagossian community that is represented by the government of the Seychelles, and there'll be diaspora, smaller diasporas elsewhere in the world. And that is what parliamentary democracies are for, that's what democratic representation is for, and that's what I think many of us would want to see achieved here. Human Rights Watch, which I'm sure is an organisation the Honourable Gentleman engages with on a regular basis, have called for the inclusion of community voices, saying that righting half a century of wrongs to the Chagossian people means full reparations, their right to return in dignity and prosperity, full compensation for the harm they have suffered, and guaranteed that such abuses never happen again. And I think that is where we ought to try to find some kind of consensus. I come from a political tradition where sovereignty lies with the people, not with a crown, not with a parliament, and certainly not with a government. And in reality, sovereignty always does ultimately lie with the people. People have the fundamental human rights to freedom of speech, thought and assembly, and those are manifested in the right to live under the rule of law. And those rights can be denied, as they have been in the case of the Chagossians, but they cannot be taken away. So that's why, in amongst all the negotiations, questions about the future of the base on Diego Garcia, which incidentally I think, and this is one of the questions I wanted to ask in an intervention, probably took quite a lot of concrete to establish. So I think I'm not sure if I completely understood the Honourable Member's argument. It appeared to be that in the 1960s, it was okay for the United Kingdom to buy an island and militarise the South Indian Ocean and pour lots of concrete on Diego Garcia and forcibly displace a population in doing so. But now it would be completely wrong for any other government to consider such course of action. Well, perhaps it was, I find the notion that we should tell other countries to do what we say and not do what we do, not always the most conducive to building world peace and stability. So in amongst all of those questions, I think we do have to put the interests of the community first. We, as members, have a duty to scrutinise the government and to speak out on behalf of our constituents, whether they're members of the Chagossian community, whether they're those, like those who contact me, who are committed human rights activists who believe that everyone in the world should enjoy the rights we too often take for granted here in the United Kingdom. But I hope that the government's movements on this at last do lead to some kind of equitable status that resolves the question of sovereignty in international law, but more importantly achieves justice at last for the people of the Chagos Islands.
I intend to start front bench speeches at 3:30, so if I can ask members to keep their comments to around 4 minutes, please. And I call on Henry Smith.
Thank you very much indeed for calling me in this important debate on the future of the British Indian Ocean Territory, and I would like to congratulate and thank my right honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury, for securing this debate and the very powerful comments that he made in his introduction. There has been injustice visited upon the Chagos Islanders for well over half a century. It was the Harold Wilson administration that forcibly removed them from their homeland, exiled them, mainly to Mauritius, but also to some other locations like the Seychelles in the late 1960s. Not a decision made by this democratic parliament, but a decision made by orders in council. The way they were then treated in Mauritius is really quite appalling. They've been treated as second-class citizens in that country, and the injustice upon injustice that they have suffered really is intolerable. I believe that they should have a right of return to their homeland, and I'm pleased that in the Nationality and Borders Act, as passed earlier this year, they now have a right of further generations to be able to settle here in this country because they are British citizens and should be by right, and I'm pleased that has been recognised. But their future should be determined by them. And the prospect of, as has happened throughout the last half century or more, the prospects of their decision, their future being decided by London, by Port Louis, by the UN in New York, by the International Court in The Hague, or wherever else, is fundamentally wrong. Chagos Islanders must be able to determine their own future. Mention has been made by my right honourable friend from Shrewsbury, Ms Cummings, of the strategic importance of the Chagos archipelago. Yes, they were very strategically important during the Cold War, very strategically important during the actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and again with seemingly a new Cold War now having started with Russian aggression, are very strategic again. The point has been made already about the threat from China. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has already seen former Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, coming under Chinese coercion and influence. And there is a very real danger that if the British Indian Ocean Territory is ceded to Mauritius, then there will be real pressure for Chinese military installations on those extremely strategic islands. That would be a major military and strategic error for the global community. And I wonder if the Minister could address this point. What discussions have been had with Washington in terms of their views, in terms of defence and foreign policy, should the islands be ceded to Mauritius? But Ms Cummings, trying to remain within the time that you are allowing, I would like to conclude my remarks by saying that, as my constituents has already been referenced, Frankie Bontemps has said of Chagossian voices, the vast majority of the Chagos community that I represent, and I probably represent the largest Chagos community anywhere in the world, the vast majority, despite the appalling history that this country has visited on them, want to remain British, and they must be consulted.
Mike Kane.
Ms Cummins, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I congratulate the member for Shrewsbury and Aitcham on securing the debate today? Since becoming a member of Parliament, it's been my great pleasure to get thoroughly involved with the Chagos community in my constituency, Ms Cummins. It numbers 300 to 400. What a wonderful community. They celebrate their annual Mass at St Anthony's in Woodhouse Park on Chagos Day every year, to which I'm invited. The food is fantastic as well. What a wonderful community. But what a horror story. You know, I describe their removal from those islands at that era as the mother of all injustices. They tell me, and I still have about 13 who are still alive who remember the weeks and the days and the weeks that it happened. Forcibly having their crops burnt, their animals shot, and then being lined up on a boat to sail 800 nautical miles away to wherever, the Seychelles or Mauritius, to Port Louis, and to have their way of life ripped asunder. What is the most horrific stories I have heard in my 8 years in this place. And then, to compound what I have called the mother of all injustices, they then have the injustice of how they were then treated in Mauritius. Going forward. And so we've had 50 years of systemic sort of failure, failing these people who live in systemic poverty. It's passed on from generation to generation. The reason why I would say to the Honourable Member for Crawley that in his constituencies they get the jobs in the airport, as they get the jobs in the airport in my constituency. And we have to do more. We have to go further and faster to begin to break down that systemic generational upon generation of poverty that they suffer. And I think we can do it. Now, the UK is subject to the rule of international law. And the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury is right. You know, we see firsthand China's tentacles everywhere, not in my constituency, in my city. And there's no need to talk to a Mancunian at the moment about what China are doing in its own consulate in my city, where the Consulate General is coming out and dragging Hong Kong protesters in and beating them up. That's a foreign state in my city perpetrating this. A consulate that we had a wonderful relationship with for 60 years, but in the last 5 or 10 years we've seen the change and the authoritative tone of the Chinese government. But we are subject to the rule of law. And this International Court of Justice ruling against us at the UN forces us into a position. And the UK has to, I think, enter some form of negotiation. But in doing so, I think we should do it in the sense, as the member for Glasgow East, North said, that there should be good outcomes for the Chagos communities. Outcomes where they can get British passports. How many of us who represent them have struggled in the Windrush generation that we've had the last few years to get them ordinary British passports, the right to remain, to do that, to get them better jobs, to get them bursaries for education, to be able to send back the natives who came if they want to burial on those islands. Now, for all sorts of reasons, I've taken over the chairmanship of the APPG. And for 8 years, sat on it, we have campaigned religiously to highlight the plight of this community. And I will meet with Chagossian voices next week, again to hear firsthand about their thoughts on these negotiations. But in my first act as chairman, I wrote to the Foreign Secretary, Ms Cummins, and he has now kindly agreed to come and address the committee early in the new year. So we will get first-hand information about where these negotiations are up to and what the intent in the British state is. But for those of us, many of us around this table who've campaigned for years on this subject, let's make sure we put the Chagossians, their rights, their dignity at the heart of everything we do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Cummins. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Shrewsbury and Aitcham for securing this debate. Now, what happened to the Chagossians between 1968 and 1973 was wrong. Britain pretended Chagossians did not exist, that the islands were not permanently inhabited, and then they participated in forced mass deportation. These people were abandoned by Britain. And in turn, in Mauritius, they faced poverty, disease, and discrimination. The British government made a mistake. But mistakes can be excellent learning opportunities. And the first thing to do is to own the mistake. Admit when you get it wrong. And I think the British government have tried to right this historical injustice. They've recognised the Chagossians as British subjects, and there is now a thriving community here in the UK. But there is plenty more to do. And another lesson that comes from making a mistake is to look to the future, to communicate, and to not repeat that mistake. And on the issue of communication, I think all MPs received a letter from representatives of the British Indian Ocean Territory citizens here in the UK, and also signed by a representative of the British Indian Ocean Territory citizens in Mauritius, where they say we are aware of the negotiations discussing the future of British Indian Ocean Territory and the Mauritian government. We want to express our strong disagreement with this negotiation, which will have a negative impact on our ancestral islands. There is still time for the British government to act on this. A ban on resettlement of the Chagos Islands in 2016 follows decades of unsuccessful legal challenges in the UK. The government decided against resettlement of the Chagossian people to the British Indian Ocean Territory on the grounds of feasibility, defence, security issues, and the cost to the British taxpayer, that there would be limited healthcare and education and a lack of jobs and economic opportunities. And I think we all accept it wouldn't be easy. But speaking personally, I think to try the very least we owe to the Chagossians. We have many successful overseas territories with small populations. And, it's just worth pointing out, by the way, Mauritius is not next door to the Chagos Islands. It's 1,300 miles away. And just in context, if we look at the distance between the Falkland Islands and Patagonia, we're talking only about 300 when we talk about that distance. But I did kind of hope that we would right this historical wrong. Consultation with the Chagossians displayed a 98% support for resettlement, and a government-commissioned feasibility study which deemed resettlement practically feasible. But I'm afraid now to enter into negotiations on sovereignty with the islands of Mauritius without talking directly to the Chagossians, I feel is not right. When it comes to the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar, we do not accept that it's a bilateral issue between Argentina and the UK and Spain and the UK, respectively. No, we ensure the Falkland Islanders and the Gibraltarians are of equal status. Self-determination is not something we can choose when it's convenient to recognise. It's either important or it's not. And, will the minister meet with the representatives of the British Chagossians? That's the question that I've come to ask. And I'm really pleased to hear the report from the member for Wythenshawe and Saylees that will happen. But will we allow the people who we removed decades ago to have a say on what happens to their homeland? They deserve representation. Let's not let history repeat itself, because despite everything we have done to them, Chagossians are proud to be British. They deserve our respect. They deserve self-determination. Let them have their say. Do not compound the error we made decades ago, because I don't think any of us wants to be here in 30 years' time admitting another historical injustice.
Yeah.
Shannon.
And can I, first of all, congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Shrewsbury for leading today's debate, and indeed it's good to discuss the sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territories. And I understand the member undertook a visit to the islands back in 2020 and maybe even further back in that, after claims that the UK's exit from the European Union could hinder the sovereignty of the British Indian Overseas Territories. So there was some knowledge, and I think the Honourable Gentleman has indicated that knowledge and how he demonstrated the speech and how he delivered the speech in the Chamber today. We have maintained and created a very stable relationship with our territories abroad and must ensure we continue this. So it's really good that we can be here to do just that. How do we do it? Honourable members have laid out their thoughts. Others have a slightly different point of view, but I think we all wish to see the same delivery. And when it comes to solutions, because the solutions is what it's all about. I always seek justice for those who have been wronged. The Honourable Gentleman for Peterborough spoke about that there early on. The first thing when you do, when something's wrong, you apologise, you recognise that, and you try to right it. And I think the Honourable Gentleman is set out to see how to do that. And hopefully the Minister will be able to give us some help. The UK shares extraordinary defence facilities with the US at Naval Support Facility at Diego Garcia. The base is crucial to Anglo-American power in the region and extends upon the order we created through and after World War II. There have been discussions on handing over the sovereignty of the islands to Mauritius, undermining, I believe, the legitimacy that Britain has over the islands. Many members here today have also raised concerns over the rise, and I do it again to reiterate, because we all recognise the potential Chinese aggression that there is across the world within the islands, especially that of the Chagos archipelago. It's important to remember that international support must be built in order to retain the legitimate sovereignty we already have. In addition to this, in 1982, and Margaret Thatcher set a precedent that the United Kingdom would do everything necessary to defend our overseas territories, and when it came to the Falklands Islands. And I think we have a duty, I believe, to honour that same commitment that there's been for the Falklands and also for Gibraltar that the Honourable Gentleman for Peterborough referred to. It is important now that the current Prime Minister carries on these legacies and promises to protect the sovereignty of all British territory abroad. The risks of handing sovereignty to Mauritius with its deepening economic ties to Beijing offer no guarantee to anyone that China won't soon have its own defence base on that very island. The geography of Diego Garcia is also posing a problem given its close proximity to China. The island is only a few hundred miles from the south of the Chinese border, and this is the UK's only defence base situated between Iran, Russia and China. So for our own safety, we have to be honest as well, for our own safety and our role that we have, I think it's important that we simply can't allow this base to come under Chinese control, and any insinuations this will be discussed are very concerning. The naval base serves as a logistics and support base for naval vessels, for warplanes, for special forces. I understand, Madam Chair, the only one of its type for this location. In addition to this, Madam Chair, the wildlife and environment of the British Indian Ocean territory are exceptional. The territory has the greatest marine biodiversity. And it's really important to state this as well. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Just on that point on the
Henry Smith.
This is critically important. A couple of years ago, there was a Japanese oil tanker that ran aground just off the Mauritian coast, and the Mauritian response was quite appalling to that. And there are deep concerns, I think, that the pristine marine environment that we have around the British Indian Ocean territory could be under risk. And will he join with me in calling on the government to ensure that that is not the case?
Jim Shannon.
My next sentence, and it's just going to be those very words along these lines. But the territory has the greatest marine biodiversity in the UK and its overseas territory. It's unique in its very texture and system that it has, as well as some of the cleanest as well. Well, in this world of where we always hear about how the oceans are so full of plastics, etc., it's the cleanest seas and the healthiest reef systems in the world. So we must, I believe, protect the environment that surrounds. Highlands also represents a nearly untouched ocean observatory, which provides researchers across the world and from all countries with a place like no other for scientific research. A unique location for scientific study, and these expeditions have contributed towards the development of the islands as an observatory for undisturbed ecosystems. The UK respects this, but we have to guarantee there will be no further threat from China in relation to marine biodiversity. Just conclude with this, Madam Chair. China poses a threat to not only the sovereignty of the islands, but also aspects of our world too. Environment in particular are referred to. Whilst the UK holds a completely legitimate sovereignty over the islands, we must encourage our other colleagues to stop the calls for sovereignty going to Mauritius. The above are what has helped us maintain the success of this relationship so far. So as far as we should do what we can to prolong this for our own safety and for this and as a base for our defence, I believe it's time, as Margaret Thatcher says, to honour, as she did in 1982, honour the people of these and the citizens of these islands in the same way. Thank you.
And I thank the Honourable Member for Chagossian Action for bringing forward this debate and introducing the debate. He said he was going to focus on self-determination in particular. I think that's very important. As other Honourable Members have said, what happened originally when that base was set up, what happened to the Chagossian people was outrageous, it was wrong, and we apologise for that. However, I'm not going to focus on the issue of self-determination. I think there are bigger issues than self-determination and sovereignty, and that is global security and defence. Back in the 60s, the base was set up for very, very good reason to mitigate against the Soviet and Chinese threat. Those threats are greater now than they were in the 60s and were throughout the period of the Cold War, and actually are more complex. I think it is unfeasible that the islands can be repopulated. Certainly I visited some of the outer islands where there were lots of graves of very small children. People died very young as children. The business of sustaining the island, the palms, was reducing even before the atrocity of the removal of individuals. But on the main island, the base is absolutely essential. It homes an airway that you can fly the space aircraft from, multiple aircraft. There's hard standing for tens of thousands of troops to be deployed around the world. And in protected area, there are a large number of ships which have military equipment on. And to call them ships perhaps is wrong. They are 7, 8-storey car parks. On each level of those car parks, there are bulletproof machinery, diggers, tanks, armoured personnel vehicles that drive off the 7th floor into the water, go across the water and invade a land. There's an ability around over 350 places around the world to deploy and sustain that level of troop commitment. This is a massive, massive facility for the global security and defence of the world. And I think we need to consider that alongside the legitimate sovereignty and self-determination issues. Originally, there was a 50-year lease. That rolled over to the 20-year lease. There's now talk, and I think an offer from Mauritius for a 99-year lease. I would urge the government to think about Hong Kong. 99-year lease, that seems such a long time ago. Yet we've seen what's happened there with China and beyond. So whatever we do, I think if the global community, which relies heavily, let's be honest, on the Americans, the global community needs that facility to protect all our citizens and global citizens. And I think that should be at the forefront of the government's mind, while trying to protect and improve Chagossians both here, the Seychelles and Mauritius. And in the past I've met with all of them, and I think there's a pragmatic understanding of there's a desire to move back, but there's a practical understanding that it is, would be very, very difficult, even without the American base and British sovereignty issues. Thank you.
I'm starting the front bench speeches now with Alan Smith.
Thank you, Ms Cummings. It's good to see you in your place. Thank you for calling me. I'd congratulate the member for bringing forward this really very interesting debate. We've had a good exchange of views this afternoon. I have to say, delighted to hear so many colleagues are in favour of the right to self-determination. We'll be back in touch about that on more domestic matters. But when it comes to the Chagos Islands, I'd try to strike a note of consensus that the old story of the American tourist who was lost in rural Ireland asked his way to Tipperary, and the local farmer said, sure, if I was going to Tipperary, I wouldn't start out from here. I think we can all agree that there has been a historic injustice done to the Chagosian people. I think we can all agree, I hope we'd all agree, that that injustice is continuing. And frankly, I'm not interested which government or which government department or how it was done did it to them. The British state has a real debt to these people. And there is an injustice that we need to focus upon above all else. Now, the SNP, starting with first principles, the SNP believes that people are sovereign, not crowns, not parliaments, as my good friend from Glasgow North said. We believe that the state should serve its people, not the other way round. We believe that people should choose their state, indeed, not the other way round. We also believe, of course, in the right to self-determination. It's one of the main reasons why the SNP exists. It's why we're in business. We also recognise, of course, that international law is sometimes messy. Black and white isn't necessarily one size fits all, especially when it comes to the Chagos Islands. So the way that this was done has been analysed in international courts. The way that the situation of the Chagosian people has been analysed by a number of credible, serious organisations. In February 2019, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled that the UK's occupation of the archipelago is illegal. That's a matter of fact. In May 2019, this was taken to the UN General Assembly, and there was an overwhelming vote to condemn the UK's continuing occupation of the Chagos Islands. And in January 21, just this year, the UN's International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea upheld that view of the General Assembly, that the UK is in the wrong. Now, what we've heard today is the reality of power politics and big state politics, but you can't have both, I'd say to colleagues. And the Chagossian people are owed a debt by this government, are owed a debt by the administration, by all of us. And I've been very glad to hear the member for Shrewsbury himself apologise. I think we all owe an apology to the people of the Chagos Islands. So some questions concretely for the Minister. The talks that have started with the Mauritian government, what's the timescale for those? I've seen one timescale that suggests this will be somehow wrapped up in a matter of months, early next year. I have to say that strikes me as a little ambitious. What would be her assessment of the timetable? We've seen the announcement of the fund that Lord Ahmed announced to compensate the Chagossian people. What's the progress of that? It struck me as inadequate, and a 10-year timescale seems rather longer than it needs to be. But what's the ramifications? What's the details of bringing that out? And where does she think, in international credibility, the UK is with this right now? I've spoken to a number of colleagues within the European Parliament, within the representations to the UN, and this is doing real damage to the UK's credibility. Because if the UK is saying that it believes in the rule of law, it believes in international cooperation, this really is an example of where that's not the case. So I think the UK government needs to take this really far more seriously than they've seen so far, but the priority has to be the Chagossian people themselves and the historic injustice that's been done to them. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship, Ms Cummings, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Shrewsbury and Atcham for securing this debate at a critical time of change for the Chagos Islands, and thank colleagues for a range of comments and contributions in today's debate. I wasn't sure totally whether to thank my honourable friend for his comments at the start of the debate about myself. We did have a very enjoyable trip to the Falkland Islands and reference declarations which will go down in due course about that. And I, of course, do agree with his characterisation that he made of our united position on the Falkland Islands and our resolute support for them, which is a long-standing position of the opposition, and I've indeed reiterated it on many occasions well before the visit, and indeed in relation to many of our other overseas territories positions that we have taken. But I would gently say from the outset that I obviously don't accept a number of the historical analysis and comparisons that he made, and neither indeed does the House of Commons Library briefing which was provided for this debate, and indeed statements that were made by the Governor of the Falkland Islands and indeed the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. And I think it's very, very important when we're talking about our overseas territories that we understand the distinct and different situations in regarding all of them, and obviously the situation around the Chagos is a particularly complex and nuanced debate, and I think we should take it in that vein and not be making comparisons in relation to other overseas territories. I want to pay tribute to colleagues across the House, particularly those with Chagossian communities and their constituencies, for the advocacy and support they've provided over many years on this issue of real sensitivity and pain for those communities, and also in raising the concerns about our diplomatic standing and commitments internationally. And I also want to express my gratitude to the all-party group, also declare my membership of that group, for their tireless efforts in keeping the Chagos Islands on the political agenda and meticulously scrutinising the policies of successive governments. And I want to say from the outset that we in the opposition welcome the government's decision to begin discussions with Mauritius around the future of the islands, but I want to set out a detailed set of questions and concerns on that matter, and I think we have to be guided really by a few key principles, and I don't set these out in any particular order of priority, but I think we have to understand the concerns around our national security and that of our allies and strategic partners, our compliance with international law and upholding our international obligations and the consequences if we do not do that, the rights and wishes of the people of the Chagos after decades of pain and hardship. I, Ms Cummins, have personally met with and heard from many different representatives from the Chagos community over many years. I've heard different views expressed by different parts of the community, but it is crucial that their distinct and different voices in some cases are heard in this process. And of course, critical also in our concerns must be those other crucial issues, particularly around the protection of the environment and the marine ecosystems around the archipelago, which have been raised by a number of members. But this is a deeply complex issue, and I want to start really with this issue of the rules-based international order, which has to be central to UK foreign policy. This historic injustice continues to prevent this from being the case, adhering to that, and I share the absolute and deep regret for past actions of previous governments, including those of Labour governments in the past. Those actions taken in the late 1960s and early 1970s were completely unjustifiable, and a number of us will have read the shocking documents from that period and language that was expressed in them, which was completely and utterly unacceptable. So we have a fundamental moral responsibility to islanders that will not go away. And I remain convinced that there must be a lasting resolution to this challenge, one that lives up to moral and legal obligations, and one that draws on the views of Chagossians around the world and is reached in cooperation with our partners and allies too. The apology must be there from all of us, and it certainly is from our side for those actions in the past, but we need to be looking to the future. We need to be looking at what is being done for Chagossians today, not just in relation to the situation in the archipelago going forward, but also for Chagossians, of course, here in many communities. The ICJ's ruling in 2019 was unequivocal in its view that the United Kingdom has, and I quote, an obligation to bring an end to its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible. And there was a vote of 116 to 6 adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which called, and I quote, for the UK to unconditionally end its occupation of the archipelago as soon as possible. That's, of course, been supported by the 2021 ruling of the Special Chamber on the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And although, of course, the tribunal did not have competence on territorial disputes, it stated that Mauritius' sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago can be inferred from the ICJ's determinations. Unfortunately, the government has spent several years simply ignoring and denying these developments, which has actually damaged our diplomatic reputation, not just with Mauritius, but also with many other countries across Africa, Asia and the Pacific, and in a range of international legal and human rights bodies. Even the Maldives, which has historically aligned with the UK government position on this, has recently changed its position to align with the rest of the international community. Now, I do take on board my friend comments regarding China and their expansion in the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean and beyond, and he raises some legitimate concerns, although I don't accept his wider characterisations of Mauritius. It is a fact that China has made increasing encroachments in the territorial waters of its neighbours and vast claims in the South China Sea, while ignoring judgments against it. And that's been, of course, matched by a growing assertiveness and even belligerence towards some of our allies and partners in the region. So I do hope the Minister can set out what assurances that we've had on these matters and on China's activities in the regions. But it's actually my view that in relation to these concerns, it's the inverse that will actually play out if we don't resolve this. Because if we make this unresolved in terms of international law, it would only play into the hands of China and others who would seek to undermine international judgments and international law. When we want to call on China to comply with the Permanent Court of Arbitration's judgment on the South China Sea, they're going to say to us, well, you're not in compliance with the ICJ or with the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, or indeed in relation to a number of other maritime and territorial disputes that are very much in our interest to be pursuing and defending resolutely. So we cannot have a situation where one hand is doing one thing and another is doing the opposite. It's also, of course, right that we do absolutely the right thing for the Chagossians. The various support packages that were announced haven't been followed through. We've seen very little money spent from that package. I wonder if the Minister can elaborate. It was supposed to be £40 million of a package. The last answer I had said that only 810,000 of that had been spent. Completely unacceptable. I hope the Minister can say something about that. What discussions has she had with all the different Chagossian groups? Of course, not just here in the UK, but many who are located in Mauritius, Seychelles and elsewhere. I'm conscious of the time, so I won't, if I may. I want to just also say about the costs that the UK government has spent on defending the indefensible in the legal position. An answer I had back said the UK had spent nearly £6 million on external legal services relating to defending cases which they then lost in the ICJ. And, of course, that's clearly unacceptable at a time of pressures on the public purse. Could the Minister provide an update on the figure of how much money has been spent on defending the previous position? I want to come on to the issue of citizenship. It's been rightly raised by a number of members, including by my honourable friend from Wythenshawe and Sale East. The Nationality and Borders Act created an entitlement for direct descendants of Chagossians who were not already citizens to acquire British nationality. Understand the process opened in November, but I hope that the Minister can set out what is going to be done to address this issue where Chagossians have been denied that right to British nationality, and ensuring that they can get what is rightfully theirs, and provide some assurances on that. Can she say a little bit? We know that previous negotiations have not gone well. They've broken down in 2009, 2016, 2017. Can she just say a little bit about the tenor and tone of the negotiations and how we're going to make sure that they go forward in a constructive spirit and achieve an agreement? On the issues of defence, I think it's absolutely crucial that we understand, and the point has been made rightly by many members, that the United Kingdom and United States defence facility in the territories plays a vital role in keeping our allies safe, us safe, drugs, piracy, national security, the activities of regional partners, supporting allies from many countries, nuclear test ban monitoring, and regional humanitarian efforts. So can she say what discussions have been had with our allies, particularly the United States, about these negotiations and ensuring that we maintain our defence capabilities in Diego Garcia? And lastly, the issues around the environment and maritime importance of the islands. Obviously, I recognise the judgment in relation to the MPA, but it is clear the importance of the archipelago. It's clear that we need to protect that environment. What discussions have been had with Mauritius so far on that, and indeed other partners in the region, and of course Chagossians, who of course believe in protecting their environment, their historical homelands, crucially as well. So I want to conclude, Ms Cummings, by just saying I think there have been some important questions asked today, some very reasonable contributions. I don't agree with all of them, the tenor in which some of them have been made, but this is a complex and nuanced issue. It requires a complex and nuanced solution. We want to engage with Chagossians here in the UK. We will work constructively with the government to find a permanent and equitable settlement which will end decades of pain for so many, whilst addressing those legitimate concerns about defence, security, the environment, the rights of Chagossians, the rights of return for them. The ultimate problem here is that this is hampering our diplomatic position in the world. It's having much wider implications. It is a historical injustice, but at the heart of it, we must remember that this was a historical injustice done to a people wrongly by a past government, and they have to be at the heart of any solution going forward.
Minister.
Thank you, Ms Cummings, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Atcham for securing this really important debate. Honourable members have all highlighted the UK's recently opened negotiations with Mauritius on the exercise of sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean territories, known as the Chagos Archipelago. My right honourable friend, the member for Braintree, the Foreign Secretary, announced the beginning of these negotiations on the 3rd of November. This had followed discussions with Mauritius at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in June and the UN General Assembly in September. I can confirm, Ms Cummings, that negotiations have now formally begun. Officials from the United Kingdom and Mauritius met on the 23rd and 24th of November and had constructive discussions. They will be meeting again shortly to continue those discussions and negotiations. You will appreciate that we will not be providing any detail on ongoing discussions or speculate on the outcome at this time, but I would like to commit and reassure members that we will keep them and Parliament informed at key junctures through the process. The UK and Mauritius intend to secure an agreement on the basis of international law to resolve all outstanding issues, and I anticipate any agreement will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act in the usual way. Let me be clear, Ms Cummings, both the UK and Mauritius have reiterated that any agreement between us will ensure the continued effective operation of the joint UK-United States Defence Facility on Diego Garcia. For more than 40 years, this joint base has contributed significantly to regional and global security. It is the result of a uniquely close and active defence and security partnership between two long-standing allies. Excuse me. The base helps the UK, the US and other allies and partners to combat some of the most challenging threats, including from terrorism, organised crime and instability. The base is well positioned as a key enabler for maritime security, including the protection of regional shipping lanes from threats such as piracy. Diego Garcia also plays a key role in humanitarian efforts, ready for a rapid response in times of crisis or disaster in the region. This includes the 2004 earthquake and tsunami in the Indian Ocean, the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and the 2013 typhoon in the Philippines. The base plays an important part in assisting the operation of the Global Positioning System, GPS, and helping the International Space Station to avoid space debris and prevent satellite collisions. We are alive to concerns regarding the influence from malign actors in the Indian Ocean. And my right honourable friend, the member for Braintree, acknowledged these concerns during his Foreign Affairs Committee evidence on the 14th of November. He assured the committee that this is an issue we take very seriously and will make sure it is at the heart of our position during the sovereignty negotiations with Mauritius. Reaching a negotiated agreement on the archipelago will allow the UK and Mauritius, as close Commonwealth partners, to work even more closely together. This will help us to tackle the regional and global security challenges that we both face, along with our wider partners, and avoid malign influences expanding into the Indian Ocean. And it will include promoting human rights and maritime security, whilst tackling illegal migration, drugs and arms trafficking. We are also keen to strengthen significantly our cooperation with Mauritius on marine and environmental protection in particular, and my honourable friend, the member for Crawley, set out some historic issues where the management of those challenges was perhaps not managed as well as it needed to be. The archipelago boasts incredible marine biodiversity, as well as some of the cleanest seas and healthiest reef systems in the world. They support 6 times more fish than any other Indian Ocean reef. The marine protected area is one of the largest in the world, prohibiting all commercial fishing and extractive activities such as mining for minerals, oil and gas, and forms a substantial part of the UK government's Blue Belt programme. The area hosts many scientific expeditions as part of our call for an international target to protect at least 30% of the global oceans by 2030. We will be pushing for this ambitious target at COP 2015 in the weeks ahead. Ms Cummings, we recognise the views of the diverse Chagossian communities in the United Kingdom, Mauritius and the Seychelles. We recognise the diversity of views in the Chagossian communities and we take those views very seriously. So while the negotiations are between the UK and Mauritius, we will ensure that we engage with the communities as negotiations progress. And I note the Honourable Member for Peterborough's kind invitation to meet with some of those communities. The UK has expressed, and indeed colleagues have too, our all profound and deep regret about the manner in which Chagossians were removed from the islands in the late 1960s and early 70s. And I hope that the voices that we have brought here today continue to reiterate that sense of horror and dismay of what happened all those decades ago. We are committed to supporting Chagossians wherever they live through the £40 million Chagossian support package, funding projects in the UK and overseas, and I'll commit to writing to my old friend to set out in more detail how that is progressing. We've also taken other steps to support the community, and on the 23rd of November, the UK government launched a new route for British citizenship for all Chagossian people and their children, free of charge. This new route will give anyone of Chagossian descent the opportunity to build their future in the United Kingdom, should they wish to do so, holding British citizenship. Ms Cummings, I've talked about ways in which the UK and Mauritius could strengthen our work together. Excuse me. The backdrop to this, of course, is our close Commonwealth partnership and our deep historical ties. We are Mauritius's second biggest export market, whilst it is our 6th biggest market in Africa for trade and investment. We are proud of its active diaspora in the UK, and hundreds of Mauritian students study in our universities every year. Meanwhile, our tourists flock to Mauritius, accounting for 15% of its annual visitors. And Mauritius is a leader among small island states in tackling climate change. The UK welcomes it as a new pioneer country for the Task Force on Access to Climate Finance and will act as an anchor donor for Mauritius. So to conclude, Madam Chair, if I may, we aim to work even... She concludes. Oh, yes.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Just before she concludes, the main tenet of my discourse this afternoon was in trying to get a commitment from her for a referendum of the Chagossian people before any decision is taken. Can she give me that commitment?
Minister.
Thank you. As I've set out, we will be making sure that we have close discussions, not only with our Mauritians, but with those communities as well. And as the negotiations progress, as I say, we will keep colleagues and Parliament abreast of how that is developing. But as we look forward, we aim to work even more closely with Mauritius to tackle those incredibly important regional and global security challenges that we all face. And we also remain fully committed to ensuring the effectiveness of the base on Diego Garcia for the benefit of regional and global security. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Daniel Kawczynski to wind up.
Thank you very much, Ms Cummings. And all I would say to wind up is that I still have not heard. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for the assurances that she has given to us and the fact that she will write to the Shadow Minister about some of the points that he has raised. But I have still not, I've heard her saying that there will be extensive consultation with the Chagossians, that they will be consulted. But I still haven't heard from her lips that there will be an internationally recognised referendum. My honourable friend from Southend quite rightly asked questions about how the matrix, the framework, the dynamics, the legality, how that would come about. I couldn't agree with him more. There have been referenda in other parts of the world under difficult circumstances where people have been able to cast the vote. I am absolutely convinced, and I will be meeting with Mr. Bontemps next week, hopefully, just to let my honourable friend know. He has left me in no uncertain terms that the Chagossians, wherever they are, Mauritius, Seychelles, Britain, or anywhere else, they are up for remaining British. And at the end of the day, as part of a British family, our duty and responsibility, first and foremost, trumping even international court decisions, is our responsibility to those Chagossians. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Jim Shannon.
I have spoken to the workers about this room. This room is so cold. You can hang dead people in here and they wouldn't go off. You know, I mean, really, the doorkeepers have asked the staff to do something with the heat, and they say the heat's turned on. I'm not sure where it is, but it's not on here. You know.
I think it's blowing cold air.
Yeah. Can I ask, Madam Chair, maybe you would use your power as chair of this room to do something about it, please? Okay. Thank you very much.
I thank my honourable friend for raising that issue. I know that the doorkeepers are busy. I am aware, very aware just how cold it is in here, and I'm sure that will be in the record. If I can just say this sitting is now suspended until 4 o'clock for the next debate. Order, order. Oh.